War is hell. My parents survived 2 wars, World War II and the Indonesian Revolution that followed. And although those wars ended, my parents' trauma never did. And so tonight, I want to dedicate my story to my parents. I was my parents' only daughter. My father was a proud, brave, and loving man who lived for the dream of becoming an American. My mother was a survivor. She carried with her the secrets of those wars. She and my father had more than a marriage. They had a trauma bond. She was a devoted wife, and she would follow my father all the days of her life. I was born in Indonesia, as were my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents. I am what is called an Indo, a blend of Indonesian from my indigenous grandmothers and great-grandmothers, and European from my forefathers who colonized Indonesia back in the 1700s. When I was born in Jakarta, Indonesia, my father proudly announced that my name would be Jane, because one day I was going to be an American. He had one goal, and that was to get his family safely to America. But unfortunately, it was the 1950s, and U.S. immigration was not interested in allowing refugees from Indonesia into this country, even if they had a daughter with the American name Jane. But my father would not give up. You see, a few years earlier, my father's beloved sister was brutally murdered in a massacre on her way home. She was killed by Indonesian militants hell-bent on killing anyone with European heritage. We had to leave. My father was fiercely protective. Nothing was going to happen to his daughter, who with each passing day reminded him more and more of his sister Deja. The only option was to wait in the Netherlands, but it gets complicated. You see, my father said that he hated the Dutch. As an Indo, he had experienced racism by the Dutch in the colonies. Also, shortly after World War II broke out, he was drafted into the Dutch military. He was captured, and for 4 years he was shackled, tortured, forced to build railroads. When he was finally released by the Japanese, apparently the Dutch government turned their backs on the Indo soldiers. And I'm not really clear about all the details, but what I am clear about was that something went wrong. But still, with no other options, and knowing that going to Europe would be a stepping stone to getting to America, my father boarded that ship to the Netherlands. And my mother, clutching her baby girl named Jane, followed him. We waited in the Netherlands through 6 long, cold, bleak winters. My best friend in The Hague had beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes, and we always played together at my house. But I was never invited inside of her house. I always had to wait outside. And one day, while I was waiting outside, I looked through her open window, and I saw her grandmother knitting. And without speaking, her grandmother got up and passed the knitting needles to me through the open window, and she gently guided my fingers with the yarn, repeating the stitches, knit, purl, knit, purl. And there began my knitting lessons outside that open window. As a child in the Netherlands, there was a lot that I didn't question. I did not question why I belonged on the outside of that open window. I did not question why my father seldom smiled, or why my mother often cried in the middle of the day while my father was at work. There was a lot that I didn't know. I didn't know that our long wait was almost over. I didn't know that my mother was packing everything she could into a steamer trunk, her walk, her rice steamer, a dress that she made for me by hand so that I would look nice when the church people came to pick us up in America. She packed away her college diploma, which in Jakarta allowed her to teach in a prestigious school. But in the United States, that diploma only allowed her to wash dishes in our school cafeteria. She was allergic to the detergent, and her hands would bleed. She worked hard for that diploma. Her studies were often interrupted when the sirens would go off, and she would have to jump on the back of a Red Cross truck in search for shelter. Sometimes that was an option, and sometimes it wasn't. She packed away her memories, never telling anyone what they did to her during those wars. She packed everything she could into that steamer trunk, each item dripping with her grief and her unspoken trauma. And then my father boarded the ship, this time to America, and my mother followed him. We arrived in America. We arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on a hot August day, and the church people came to pick us up, not with tuk-tuks, not on bicycles, but in huge cars. And they're speaking words I don't understand. But to my amazement, when I open my first school textbook, there is one word that I can read: Jane. See Jane run. I don't know what that means. I think it means I, Jane, am now in America. And there are lots of kids in my school with beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes, but they stare at me. My mother says that it's because we're different. Americans don't like dark, she explains. And when Michael, the blonde boy, kicks me and repeatedly punches me, chanting words that I don't understand, I know that my mother is right. And when the two boys, the brothers, the policeman's sons, who live across the street in the gray and the red house, when they repeatedly punch me and chant, "Go back to where you came from," I know my mother is right. But I don't tell her what is happening because the sadness in her eyes is bigger than the sadness in my eyes. I am almost 13 years old, and we are at the courthouse in Milwaukee on a very special day. So I am wearing a special dress. It is called a shift. It's got the straight lines. It's beige. It's got a ruffle across the chest and a ribbon that flows all the way down to the hemline. I wear that dress on that special day, and I wear it to my church confirmation. I also wear it almost every day of my 8th grade year at Samuel Morris Junior High School because it is the only nice dress in my closet. On that day at the courthouse, we are declared American citizens. My father says, "Jane, from now on when they say, 'What are you?' you say, 'I am an American.'" I am an American, I repeat, out of love and respect for my father. And then he led us out of the courthouse, and my mother followed him. The years come and go. I move west to Oregon, and I marry an American with beautiful blue eyes. I cook delicious meals: steak, pot roast, turkey. And I pretend that none of those things are foreign to me. I even make gravy from a recipe on the back of an Argo cornstarch box. You know, sometimes it's just not that hard to be an American. My parents retired to Arizona, and I raise a beautiful family in Eugene. My father is dying of cancer. I fly out to see him one last time, Heavily sedated on morphine, he hears my voice and he opens his eyes. And for the first time, I see a look of fear and terror in his eyes. Softly but fiercely, he utters, "Run, run." I realize he's seeing his sister Deche. "Papa, it's me, Jane." He's undeterred. "Run, run." I try another tactic. "Papa, don't worry, I am strong. I can run fast." "No, you are small. Run." His eyes close. We bury my father. My mother sings his favorite hymn at his funeral, and we get in the car together to go to the reception. She turns to me, and for the first time, I see no sadness in her eyes. It is as if the trauma has lifted. She says, "Jane, I am going with him." And before we get to the reception, she has a fatal heart attack. My parents had more than a marriage. They had a trauma bond. Before his death, my father picked out a single grave headstone for them, and prophetically he had it engraved, "Together forever." My father left this world, and my mother followed him.